afternoon, everyone. This is Indrani and welcome to your favorite show, Immigration Law. As you know, in this show, we usually discuss about immigration laws, visa processing and visa categories of several countries. Today's topic is immigration laws of Australia, and for that, we have a special guest with us. Today, we have Mr. Christopher Levingston from Australia. Good afternoon, sir. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you very much. Thank you for asking me to appear.
We're gonna start our discussion for today.
Great.
Okay. First of all, I want to ask that what type of visa categories in Australia?
That's a great question. A good question to start with. There are about 99 visa categories, so each case has to be fitted into a particular category, a bit like a key in a lock.
Can you please tell us the basic categories of Australia?
Visa categories are as follows. 1, family visa stream, business visas, temporary visas, permanent visas, and they fall into the whole range of visa categories identified in the migration regulation. So you have the Migration Act, you have the regulations, and if you want to ask specific questions about visas, you just identify the visa you want to talk about and I'll be able to talk about it sensibly so I can help your viewers.
Okay, I want to know about some permanent basis visa categories.
Okay, so permanent visa categories, both inside and outside of Australia. I'll start in the
Inside Australia.
I'm talking about an applicant applying offshore for an onshore visa. So in the spouse category of visas, if you are offshore, that is in Bangladesh, and you're going to apply for a spouse visa, you apply for what's called a 309-100. That visa has a mirror visa in Australia called the 82801. And that 82801 is for people who are physically present in Australia and can make that application. So the visa category streams are streamed into 2 broad categories. Onshore applications, that is applications you make when you are in Australia, and applications that you make while you are outside of Australia, so onshore and offshore.
Okay, then I want to shift the topic on business visa categories. So what are the process?
Okay, so in the business visa categories, if you don't have a sponsor already organised to sponsor you for migration to Australia, you need to go on to what's called Skill Select, which allows a candidate to upload through a process called an expression of interest their qualifications and their experience so that they can be offered a place for migration to Australia in one of the visa categories. And it might be that you're looking for temporary visa, like a 482 visa, with a view to making a transition after about 3 years to a permanent visa under the employer nomination scheme.
For a business visa, how much money a person should invest to your country?
That question really relates to what's called the 188 visa scheme. So that provides for people to migrate to Australia upon investing a significant amount of capital, 5 million Australian dollars for migration to Australia. And what that visa is intended to do is to create an investment platform for candidates who are offshore. There are also subcategories within the visa subclass 188 where people with less resources at their disposal, but with a developed business opportunity, to be sponsored by a regional or state government authority for them to migrate to Australia and to be given the opportunity of being able to create a business in Australia. As a general rule, those candidates require a substantial amount of capital, but perhaps most importantly, they also are required to have a successful business record, at least 5 years preceding the making of the application. That application can be made onshore or offshore, but the advantage of making an application onshore is that if the application is refused, you have review rights, whereas if you make an application offshore, you often do not have review rights.
For which issues usually a business visa can be declined? from your side?
As a general rule, it's the failure of documentation and the failure to establish that you've got a successful business record, and perhaps most importantly, that you've been paying taxes in, for example, Bangladesh. If you had a substantial business record and you've got funds at your disposal, you have to show where that money has come from, so that the department tends to dive very deep into your history. So if, for example, you weren't paying the right amount of tax and that was discovered by the Department of Immigration, or the documentation wasn't correct, that application would be refused. And they're the most common reasons why applications are refused.
Now, I want to talk about different kinds of working visas, such as what kind of opportunity have you for skilled working visa?
If the candidate is offshore, that is in Bangladesh, what they should do is they should consult what's called the occupation lists. And there are two occupation lists. There is the short-term skilled occupation list, and then there is the medium-term occupation list. Those occupation lists determine who can come to Australia, that is, who has the skills that are necessary. For example, if, for example, you were an expert in human relations and you had qualifications overseas that were recognised in Australia, and you had sound work experience which could be verified, then you would be looking for that occupation on the skilled occupation list so that you could migrate to Australia. As a general rule, it's overall better to have a sponsor, that is, to be sponsored for the visa, because then you've got an interested party in Australia, so that if the application is refused, you're going to have review rights. But the key to the skilled migration categories are the occupation lists. So unfortunately, if you are over 45, you can't get skilled migration to Australia unless it is for temporary residence.
So now I have a question from our audience, and that's, I have been working as a lineman in rural electricity in Bangladesh for 8 years long. I'm 29 years old and I have completed my higher secondary school. Can I apply for skill visa without any kind of job offer?
Yes, you can, and you're at the right age, that is, you're under 45, you've got work experience, but your problem is going to be involve two factors. One is you have to be able to speak English at the right level through an IELTS test, and you can get all this information online, and you would need to have your qualifications as an electrical linesman recognised in Australia. And what I would recommend in respect of that potential candidate is that potential candidate come onshore on a student visa, get their qualifications up to scratch and get recognised, and then seek a position onshore for a 482 visa.
We just heard about a visa category named carer visa. Can you please explain to us?
Okay, so a carer visa is a visa which allows a relative of an Australian citizen or permanent resident to come to Australia and care for their relative, but you have to be related. Then the relative needs to show that they can't reasonably obtain the care that they need from local government agencies and other support services in Australia. As a general rule, the processing time on these applications are very extended, often more than 10 years. But if you are onshore, you can apply for a carer visa, and then the processing time is not really a problem because you are onshore and you have a bridging visa A, and you can remain onshore, but the processing times are very extended.
What are the criteria for a carer visa?
You need to have an Australian citizen or permanent resident relative, mother, father, brother, sister, uncle, aunt. That's as a general rule, but you've got to be related. And then they have to have a disease or a condition that requires them to have care. That level of care is determined by reference to a medical report prepared for and then ultimately analysed and assessed by by the medical officer of the Commonwealth. So you've got to have some serious medical condition, and they have a scoring protocol. But all of that information you can obtain online or through the services of a registered migration agent, or you can contact me. It's not a problem.
Suppose I don't have any kind of relatives such as father, mother, cousin, or anybody there, but I have a friend, maybe he's very sick, she's very sick. So then can I apply for a carer visa for him or her?
No, I'm afraid not, because you're not in that level of relationship.
Okay.
And the reason why they're so specific is because this is the sort of care that we provide to each other in our own families. For example, my mother's 92 years of age. She needs care. So myself and my two brothers provide her with care and assistance on a day-to-day basis.
Okay. So do you have any kind of extraordinary visa categories for some of artists, journalists?
There's what's called the Global Talent Visa, Global Talent Visa, and that allows for people who've got exceptional skills to be sponsored by either an Australian organisation or an Australian citizen, for those people to be able to migrate to Australia so that those skills become available. Let me give you a couple of examples.
Sure.
A person who, for example, would be in the cricket team or had been a member of the Olympic team might well find themselves in a situation where they could obtain support and sponsorship from an Australian-based organisation, because that organisation wants to acquire those particular skills which are going to ultimately be of benefit to the wider Australian community. And that's called the Global Talent Visa. It's got certain technical aspects to it which are a bit complicated, but the most important thing that we can say about this particular visa is that you have to have an exceptional record of achievement. So it covers both the arts and academia, as well as fields of scientific endeavour, but you've got to have this international profile. So if, for example, you were an expert in immunology or you were a cybersecurity expert, you might be able to get one of these visas.
But there is no chances for actors, dancer, journalists?
An internationally famous entertainer, actor, dancer, whatever, you would be able to be considered for that category. But you've got to have a current, very high record of achievement, and you've got to be able to get the support you need. As I said to you earlier, the best place to apply for a visa is onshore in Australia, so that you don't get caught up in the delays in processing when you are offshore, and you've got access to review rights.
We know after COVID-19 there are so much changes happened in the immigration law before, but what are the recent changes in your law that people should be aware of?
Well, I think that student visas are going to be much harder to get because the current position of the Australian government is that students are applying for student visas, but they're being unsuccessful. And there are some colleges that have engaged in some activity which I suspect is unlawful, where people aren't attending school, but they're still getting qualifications. So student visas are under a lot of scrutiny at the moment. That scrutiny is frightening a lot of the academic institutions who provide these services, including Sydney University. And I'm not suggesting that Sydney University is doing anything wrong, but Sydney University, because they're trying to avoid a high visa refusal rate, they're finding themselves caught up where they're having to make strategic and economic decisions where they might, for example, say, we're not going to take any more students from Bangladesh, or we're not going to take any students from India, or we're not going to take students from Pakistan or Nepal. So they're doing that because they don't want to get a high visa refusal rate. Now, the reason why student visas are refused most often is because the student can't demonstrate that they've got a genuine intention to remain in Australia temporarily. That's what's called the GTE requirement. So if I'm in Bangladesh and I'm saying I would like to study a master's degree, then the first question that immigration is going to be asking will be, well, why are you coming to Australia to study a master's degree? Why can't you do your master's in Bangladesh or do it in the US or wherever? So immigration takes the view that, at least to a certain extent, student visas, although they're very, very important to the Australian economy, and I think that they ranged prior to COVID at about minimum $13 billion, students have been put off by the high failure rate. So you can go through and you can make an application for a student visa and it might be refused and you can keep on applying, but it becomes very, very difficult. What I would recommend to anybody who's going to apply for a student visa is that they engage the services of a migration agent in Australia who's also an education agent so they can lead them through that process. It is absolutely critical that all of the documentation be genuine, because immigration dives very deep into the documentation and will often be, through its diplomatic and international contacts, be able to make contact with an institution which says, for example, oh, this person graduated with a Bachelor of Arts. Sometimes those checks reveal that people are claiming qualifications that they don't in fact have.
Now we have a question from our audience. Once again, I am MSc Civil Engineer, MBA and Registered Professional Engineer. So how can I get a job in Australia? Kindly suggest me.
Well, the search for a job you should probably undertake through SEEK in Australia, SEEK, and see what jobs are being advertised. But as a civil engineer and people with strong engineering backgrounds, you're going to need to have a resume which details all of your qualifications and your experience, and you have to also be in a situation where you can pass the IELTS test and have your qualifications recognised in Australia. So that's all part of the skilled migration program. It's very difficult to find a job when you're sitting in Bangladesh and the position's being advertised in Australia. But at the end of the day, if you keep your eyes peeled, something might come up. But in the meantime, there is no downside to going to Skill Select and launching an expression of interest, because you'll see how you're scoring as against the criteria that assess the application. An expression of interest costs nothing. And it's a very good way of getting yourself, as it were, into the mix for the consideration. So you might get a visa on that basis. But the Skill Select process is transparent and it's a points-based system. So I would recommend that.
How can a potential immigrants ensure their qualifications and work experiences are recognized in Australia?
No problem. So if I'm a civil engineer, then there is a legislative instrument which tells us what assessing organisation is charged with the task of assessing qualifications. So, for example, an engineer would have to provide their details and make an application through Engineers Australia. Engineers Australia would then recognise the qualifications and the experience, and that positive skills assessment would drive the application. So there's a legislative instrument which sets out all the individual assessing authorities. Engineers Australia, you might have a trade which could be assessed by either an organisation called Vet Assess, or you could get assessed by TRA. So there's this big schedule which says if your occupation is engineer, then you look across the schedule and then you can see that it's Engineers Australia. And all that information is available on the immigration websites. And a lot of information is published by migration agents who are actively engaged in this field.
We have known that after COVID-19, there are so many chefs left your country. So Australian governments are looking for so many chefs from all across the world. Is that true?
Yeah, it is true, because what happened was during COVID, people who held temporary visas, like a 482, for example, couldn't get any government support. And
it's not permanent.
Yeah, so that's the temporary visa. So the temporary visa leads into a process where after 3 years holding a temporary visa, a visa subclass 482, you can proceed to a permanent visa. So there's nothing stopping a person who's got chefing qualifications, who undergoes a skills assessment, who can speak English at the right level, for that person to lodge an application in Skill Select. But having contacts on the ground in Australia is also very useful, because Australia is really quite a small place. Everybody really knows each other. And so it might be within your circle of friends that you've got an associate who's already working in a restaurant where the boss is looking for a chef. Under those circumstances, you could be sponsored for migration to Australia, in some cases for a permanent visa.
So now can you please tell us about health workers visa?
Okay, so health workers, medical practitioners and nurses, there's a big worldwide shortage of nurses and medical practitioners. The biggest impediment to those people being able to migrate to Australia is the skills recognition process. Anybody who's already a registered nurse has got qualifications and experience, not only in Bangladesh but also overseas. They should be able to come onshore and upgrade their qualifications through some bridging course. But in the case of medical practitioners, it's a bit more complicated, because you have the professional colleges. There's another sort of a visa called a medical treatment visa, which is really for a person who needs to undertake medical treatment in Australia, for that person to apply for permission to be able to travel to Australia, for example, to have some corrective surgery. Under those circumstances, what you need to do is you need to clearly establish that you have the need for the surgery, and that at the end of the surgery, it's your intention to return home. And that's what's called the genuine temporary entrant visa. So what you would do is you would say, I've got this particular condition, I've got an appointment to see this particular specialist, and I'm booked in for surgery at a particular hospital in Australia. That would be the ideal application. But the question at the overseas post will always be asking is, well, why are you travelling to Australia for the surgery? Well, it might be that you have a view that your condition is best treated in Australia. But that question about whether or not you are a genuine temporary entrant is always first and foremost in the mind of the assessing officer.
So now we have a question from our audience regarding this. I have completed 5 years of medical course on state medical faculty in Bangladesh, 4 years academic and 1 year of internship. Would you please tell me which health workers visa is applicable for me?
Well, you sound like a medical practitioner, a general practitioner. You're going to need to have your qualifications and your experience assessed by the relevant medical board in Australia. Because these boards are run by professional associations, they're very protective of the standard of healthcare. So, for example, if you had a qualification from an English or an Irish hospital and you're qualified as a doctor in the UK, that would lead relatively easily through a process which would see your qualifications recognised in Australia.
Sir, but he doesn't have any kind of experience.
No, I understand that. So absent experience, what I would recommend is that you would consider coming onshore and then studying a specialisation and then getting your experience onshore, your clinical training done. So the candidate that you referred to had 12 months post-qualification experience. The question is, are those qualifications going to be recognised, and is that clinical experience going to be recognised? If it's not going to be recognised, then you're going to have great difficulty. But one thing I have noticed from time to time when my mother goes to hospital, a lot of the nursing staff are from Bangladesh, Nepal, from the Philippines. So really, there's a big demand for people with nursing qualifications and experience in Australia. It is a very good category to be in, and there are specialist migration agents, some of them are lawyers, who specialise in this particular area, and they recruit people.
Thank you. So let's come to the point of partner visa.
Partner visas are, in my view, very, very straightforward, but often mishandled by applicants. You can't afford to pay a huge filing fee, now in excess of $8,500, and then have your application fail. Oh. If you've got a genuine ongoing relationship and you've got a very clear narrative about the circumstances of your meeting, how and when you meet, how the relationship developed, etc., and you've got evidence in support of the marriage or a de facto relationship and your dealings with the wider community, if you've got all of that information and you prepare and file an application yourself, the biggest mistake that people make is that after lodging the application, they don't do anything with it. What they do is they let it sit in the system until the case officer gets onto it. Because the processing times are so slow at the moment, that might take over 2 years. What you need to do, and this is very, very good advice, is that you need to refresh the application every 6 months. So you put on additional evidence of cohabitation, or your communication with your partner, or the fact that your partner is sending money for your support, or that you've got children in common. All of that interaction is then refreshed on a 6-monthly basis, so that when the case officer eventually opens the case, they've got a real-time snapshot of the relationship, not only from the date the relationship is claimed, but also thereafter that the relationship is genuine and continuing. That's the secret to a successful application. And there's a regulation specifically called Regulation 1.15 capital A brackets 3, which sets out what I describe as a statutory shopping list of what you need in order to support your application.
Once you got declined from that process, what kind of steps you should take for that?
Okay, so if your application is refused, because you have a sponsor, the sponsor makes an application on your behalf for a review of that decision at what's called the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. The Administrative Appeals Tribunal, you pay them a filing fee, $3,533, I think it is. You lodge your application, and the Administrative Appeals Tribunal will take about 721 days to get to your case, which is why it's always better to lodge an application onshore while you are onshore, so that you're not troubled by the delay. Because the fact of a couple being separated for 2, in some cases 3 years, puts the relationship under a lot of pressure.
So if anyone who has been applied for an immigrant visa, but suddenly he got married, then what should he do?
If the applicant is holding a current visa and they got that visa before they got married, then they subsequently get married, what they have to do is they have to prove to immigration that they've got a genuine ongoing relationship. So they need to establish, and they need to then create a pathway for the subsequent visa holder. There's a slightly quicker way to do that, which is entirely in accordance with the regulations. So let's assume that I'm onshore and I'm holding, for example, a student visa, and my student visa is going to expire in November 2024. I got married 6 weeks ago, we'll say. I now want to bring my spouse to Australia, but I've already got my student visa. What you do is you lodge a fresh application for a student visa, and this time include your spouse, so that when the fresh student visa is granted, it extinguishes, wipes out the original student visa, and you've got a brand new student visa with a spouse who can join you in Australia. That's a very good strategy.
What are the rights and responsibilities of immigrants once they have arrived in Australia? How can they integrate with the Australian people there?
Temporary residents of Australia, that is people who aren't permanent, are treated like visitors to any other country. So they have the same obligations as Australian citizens and permanent residents to obey the law of the land, but they don't have access to the resources that Australian citizens and permanent residents have. Namely, it's going to be very difficult to buy property, for example, without the right permission. You can't vote in elections. You're still taxed, but you don't have any representation. So in the transition from temporary residence, there is the expectation that you would behave yourself, you'd obey the law, you wouldn't drink and drive, you wouldn't get engaged in family violence, you wouldn't assault anybody. Under those circumstances, there's the expectation of good behaviour. But the same thing would apply to me, for example, if I was visiting Bangladesh. They do not have the rights of Australian citizens and permanent residents, which basically are confined to voting and other sorts of rights which attach to citizenship, which also include military service, for example. There are community organisations that look after the interests of people from Bangladesh.
Yes.
That you've got community support, you've got access to a mosque, all of those sorts of things that you would take for granted as being part of your local community. Well, you would have the reasonable expectation, at least in the major cities in Australia, that you can have access to the other members of your community and all the things that you would expect, which would make your life in Australia a little bit sweeter.
Are there any upcoming policy changes or trends in Australian immigration that viewers should keep an eye on?
Big change, which is coming soon, and it's going to be a big change, will be in relation to student visas. I think it's going to be harder to get a student visa to come to Australia. But if that's the case, then think about this. There's a strategy that you might want to consider to get around it, because there's been a trans-Tasman agreement for nearly 50 years between Australia and New Zealand. So if you don't think that you're going to get a visa in Australia, think about a visa to New Zealand, because if you become a New Zealand citizen, you can live and work in Australia, no problems.
Now we want to shift to a visitor visa. So what are the basic requirements for obtaining an Australian visit visa?
All right, okay. So for a tourist visa, the basic requirements are these. 1, that you are in good health. 2, that you don't have any character concerns, criminal record. 3, that you are a genuine temporary entrant. So how do we prove that we're a genuine temporary entrant? You've got to have a reason for wanting to come to Australia. It's not enough for you to say, I'd like to travel to Australia because I've seen lots of interesting things about kangaroos.
Side visit.
You would need to have a solid reason, and my suggestion would be that you would have an itinerary. In other words, that you would know where you are going and what the purpose of your visit is. It's about the power of persuasion. What are your family connections in Australia? What are your family connections in Bangladesh? Why would you return to Bangladesh at the conclusion of the visitor's visa? They're the critical factors that underpin the consideration of a genuine temporary entrant.
Okay, then how many countries a traveller should travel before applying for a visa in Australia?
That's a really, really good question. If you have a history of international travel and you can show that you've complied with your visa, you are more likely to get a visitor's visa. If you have never travelled, then the question's going to be asked, well, why is Australia your first destination? It's all about whether or not you're a genuine temporary entrant. People with an established international travel history are more likely to succeed. But you've got to bear this in mind. If you've ever applied for a visa for the UK, America, New Zealand, Canada, or Australia and been refused, all of that data is shared between what's called those 5 I's. Those countries know if you've applied for and been refused a visa. So if you're asked a question on a visa application form which says, have you ever applied for a visa and it was refused and you tick no, they're going to know that you've applied for, you had a visa that you might have overstayed in the US. So your immigration history internationally is going to help you, or in some cases, it may not help you.
So now, can you share some success stories of some of clients that you have helped with their Australian immigration journey?
Okay, so I'll just deal with a case I'm dealing with at the moment. We have a lady who is a permanent resident of Australia, and she got her permanent residence on spouse grounds. She has an Australian citizen child. So her husband, who is the sponsor, went to jail and is serving a term of imprisonment of 7 years, so a serious criminal offence. Immigration wrote to the lady and they said to her, why didn't you tell us that your husband was in jail before we granted you a permanent visa? And she said, well, I didn't know that I had to. And then they cancelled her visa. When the case went to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, I was able to overturn the cancellation because the fact of the husband having gone to jail had no impact on her eligibility. It's very difficult to look at a case and say, oh, because this worked, this is going to work for you. It requires the application of skill and expertise. Unless you've got expertise, you're really just facing a rules-based system. What I bring to the table, and my advice is based on 35 years experience. I've been an accredited specialist for over 25 years. So I know what I'm talking about because I've seen lots of people be unsuccessful for reasons to me that seem obvious. But a candidate who is well represented, who has got a good case, the lawyer or migration agent can make it better. They can't make a bad case good. They can only ever make a good case better. So you've got to have a good case.
Sir, thank you so much for your precious time that you gave us, and I hope that you enjoyed our show as well. Can you say some words about us?
Very highly regarded. It was recommended to me by one of my colleagues who came from Bangladesh, and I understand it's got a very high viewership in Bangladesh. And all I would like to say to everybody in Bangladesh is see you in Australia sometime.
Thank you so much, sir. So everyone, that's all for today. So hope to see you on next episode in the same time on the same channel. So bye-bye for now.